Welcome to Autism Approved, brought to you by Enzymedica. Now here's your host, Kristin Selby Gonzalez.
Hi, I'm Kristin Selby Gonzalez, and welcome to Autism Approved. 1 out of 91 children are being diagnosed with autism between the ages of 3 and 17. That's 1 out of 58 boys. We knew it was more important than ever to bring you a show that offered you hope, resources, and tools. Well, today I have a very, very special guest and a mother that inspired me so many years ago, and I'm just so excited to have you here today, Shannon. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
I remember, I don't even know how many years ago that was. It must have been at least 5 or 6.
Yes, I was saying probably 5.
Yes, and I think that was probably my second Autism One conference. And I remember walking into this room and sitting down, not really having any idea what I was about to hear. And I heard your story. And I know for the viewers out there, I would love for you to tell it because it's touched me in such a way. I've retold your story, I can't even count how many times, to a parent that might have been crying, sitting there talking to me. And it was something that I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. And so it's one of those, your story is just one of those stories. And I think you realize it, but I don't know if you really realize it, how many people you touch on a daily basis. And
well, thank you. And it's really Grace's story to be told. I mean, right now I'm basically her mouthpiece until she, has her own voice to be able to tell this story. So,
well, can you please tell us the story? Because I love it so much.
Well, my daughter Grace, as you know, was diagnosed with a really rare mitochondrial disease. But before we even got to that diagnosis, we spent a year and a half fighting the symptoms, not knowing what the underlying disease was. So when I first knew something was wrong with Grace, it took me about 3 months to convince her physicians that something was wrong. They kept telling me I was just being, overreacting, and I was just being a really concerned mom. But I had an older daughter that, was my first, so I knew that the different milestones, and my daughter Grace just wasn't reaching those. So by the time I convinced them that there was something wrong with her, they had sent me to a ophthalmologist and a neurologist in the same day. And we went to the ophthalmologist first, and I said, see what she's doing with her eyes? And she would roll them up and back really rapidly. And he said, those are, I believe, seizures. And so he said, I'm not even going to let you drive to your neurology appointment. We need to call the ambulance and have your daughter taken to the hospital. And so we get to the hospital. The neurologist that we were supposed to meet in clinic met us at the emergency room. And sure enough, they put her in the ER. They did an EEG. The neurologist came out and said, we need to admit your daughter. And she has a seizure. She's having seizures. We need to know why. And I just remember thinking, even early on in that moment in the emergency room, when they told me she was having seizures, I was kind of relieved because I had a friend in high school that had epilepsy, and I thought, seizure disorder, it's treatable, it's, I can handle this, let's just get her into the hospital, get her medication, and get out the door. What I thought was going to be, maybe a week stay to get her regulated on medication turned into 6 months, because when they put Grace on the seizure medicines in the hospital, she still was not metabolizing them, and she was still having, 100 seizures an hour. And they said, there has to be something else going on with your daughter. And so I said, well, what is it? And they're like, we just don't know. And so basically that first time that we got her into the hospital when she was 3 months old, she didn't come home from the hospital until she was a year and a half old, by the time we first got to bring her home. And we were just continually doing testing. They were ruling out really rare diseases. And we were in the Mayo Clinic having a brain biopsy done on Grace because they thought she had a disease called Batten's disease, when we were waiting for a muscle biopsy to come back for another disease. And when we got out of the brain biopsy, they came in and said, we got her test results from the other biopsy and that your daughter has a really rare mitochondrial disease. And I remember thinking in that moment, wow, we have a diagnosis, and now I have a prognosis. I remember being relieved. And then everybody in the room was still really quiet. And I said, what is the problem? And they said, well, we're really sorry to tell you this, but at this point in time, there's only 4 other cases cited in the world with this type of mitochondrial disease, and they all died before the age of 2. And at this time, Grace was a year and a half old, and she had seizures. She was on 42 different medications. She could not sit up, talk, walk. She was fed by a feeding tube. She had to be kept warm under heat lamps. And so when they said that to me and had said that, we really don't have anything we can do, it's terminal, and this just looks like it's going to happen soon, it was probably the lowest moment in my life when they were telling me you know, now that we know, you need to just take her home, make her comfortable, because you probably have a couple weeks left with your daughter. And those couple weeks turned into a couple months, and Grace was hanging on. She was a fighter. I mean, she still wasn't sitting up, talking, walking. She still looked through me instead of at me. She was blind. Still, in my mind, didn't know that she had a mom or a sister that loved her. And I'd heard about a therapy called hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And the state of Wisconsin, how it works in the hospital system is my private insurance had dropped us when Grace's bills reached over $10 million. So Grace went on state aid. And so they were doing really well at fighting everything when they were getting paid privately. Mm-hmm. But the minute I went on state aid, all of a sudden nobody wanted to do anything to save Grace any longer. And so they made recommendation to cease all life support means for Grace. And they won. And they were going to do that on a Friday. I had researched hyperbaric oxygen therapy for kids that had cerebral palsy.
And didn't you also go to the chapel as well?
I did. Oh, that, yeah. The story about the chapel is my family priest came to meet with me and my family. Now, anybody that has a special needs child knows that it's really different for the person, the parent that lives it, because it's their child. As much as aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins and so forth live it with you, they really don't live it with you because it's not their child. And my family had done somewhat of an intervention because they felt that I was neglecting my marriage. I was, neglecting the other daughter, Lily. And they said that, you really need to come to terms with this and you need to let this go. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in the chapel, I remember looking at our family priest and just getting mad and saying, you know what, you're right. I believe that God does things for a reason, but I think that God's testing me, not Grace. I think that God is telling me that I need to do something to fight for my daughter, that I'm the one being tested. And if I just let her go, that means that I failed. Because I knew that if I just let Grace go without trying, that there was probably no possible way that I could be a full mother to my other daughter. And so at that moment in time, I told all my family members that if you were not going to be on board with what I was about to do, that there was no part of my life. And didn't you have
to call then because they wanted to take the life support off and
what happened was they were going to be ceasing all feeding tubes, all that stuff on a Friday. I took her out of the hospital on that Wednesday against medical advice, even though everything was going to cease on Friday. Made it clear to me that if Grace died, in between going from Wisconsin to Florida, that I would be held accountable. Though, 48 hours later, I wasn't even going to have a child. I was going to be at a funeral home, picking out a casket, and putting my daughter to rest. So we ventured to Florida and to do hyperbarics, and it changed our life.
Oh my gosh, and how old is she today?
Today, Grace is 12 years old. Yeah, she's 12 years old.
Because what if you would have listened?
If I would have listened, I would be visiting my daughter's grave.
And you didn't listen because there was something in you that just knew.
Well, I think that when I tell my story and parents say, I've had that just even this weekend at this conference where a parent came up and said, listening to you, it just makes mine seem so insignificant. And I try to explain to people that everybody's is their own journey. And yes, was my daughter really severe? Yes. But guess what? If all your child doesn't do is talk and you've never heard them say, Mama, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
You should be sad about that.
Yeah.
You should feel the way that you feel. You should feel a mourning process because everybody has the right to have their child say mama and dada and be able to know that they know what that means. Just because Grace had so many other things doesn't make her any more different than the kids that maybe only have one or two deficiencies. And I always try to tell parents that yes, Grace had huge obstacles, but in reality, your pain is the same as my pain because our child is not the way that we thought that our children were going to be.
And so then you put her in a hyperbaric.
I put her in hyperbarics. I get her to Florida. Takes 4 hospital stays to get her there. And it's just me and my mom and dad and Lily and Grace driving in a car. And I get her there. We stabilize her at Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital. The radiologist says, I said, could you please do a SPECT scan of her brain? I'm here to do hyperbaric therapy. I heard about SPECT imaging. I want to know. And he's like, and he finally agreed to it, came back and said, Shannon, I agree with all the other doctors. You probably just need to take Grace home because her brain is so not correct and she's lacking so much oxygen in so many areas of her brain that you need to just take her home. I said, I raised all this money. I wouldn't even know how to give the money back to people, because people would just send in $5, $10 when they heard our story. And I said, I just want to try it so that I can let her go. I mean, really, when I tell parents that I did hyperbarics, I didn't think it was going to work, but I knew that I needed to do something so that I could let go and know that I tried everything. I never imagined what I would get. And we got her stable. We did the hyperbarics, and within 40 treatments, Grace started to move her fingers, and she started to lift her head. And
when you first saw that, what did you do?
At first, I was very cautious, and I waited like about 3 weeks, and I finally just had the nerve to say to my mom and dad, are you seeing what I'm seeing, or am I just wanting this so bad? Because I know that if this doesn't work, that was it for Grace.
Yeah.
And so I kept thinking in my head that I was making it up, because the thought of burying her was emotionally too